On the evening of Easter Day, the disciples are motivated by one desire, and that I describe as to stay together, or perhaps even to huddle together. Fear was a very real experience for them, and it's not surprising, is it? Resurrection has occurred, and some of them had been witnesses to it, but their spirits had not yet been transformed, even though this news was being told about when they gathered together. But we read from John chapter 20. I want to read these verses to you, a little longer than sometimes, but it's really two passages, Jesus appearing to the disciples and Jesus appearing to Thomas. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I'm sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. As you forgive anyone else's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they're not forgiven." Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." And he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Let me, as I examine this, remind you of some of the key facts. Jesus came and stood among them. Jesus came and stood among them behind locked doors. We're told the reason why the doors were locked, they were fearful. Jesus came and stood among them, and so his risen power would be so obvious to those that were gathered there. That's a first factor in trying to understand the message in this passage. Secondly, when Jesus came and stood among them, we're told something of the reaction of the disciples. They were overjoyed. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. So there was obviously an immediate recognition. So it was the same Jesus who had walked to Galilee, who had talked, who had healed the sick, who had reached out to them, and who had called them to be disciples. But they were overjoyed because they knew all about the crucifixion and the death and suffering of Jesus. So it was a very real experience. Another factor, Jesus twice spoke of peace in verses 19 and 21, which I'll remind you of. On the evening of that first day of the week, when they met together, it goes on to say, Jesus said, "Peace be with you." Then in verse 21, again Jesus said, "Peace be with you." This was a resonating truth, not only in John's Gospel, but throughout the whole of that early life of the church. And very often when people come together to worship, they pass the peace one to another. Peace is a real sense of the presence of God. The resurrection in John is a merging of resurrection, ascension, and Pentecost. They're all brought together. But now the account of Thomas, because this demonstrates the risen power of Christ. And we all know that Thomas was not there when Jesus first appeared to them. We don't know why he wasn't there. Perhaps he was distressed. Perhaps he was so caught up in the bereavement and grief of death that he couldn't possibly be with other people. That's how some folks react, don't they, to a difficult situation. And yet Jesus demonstrates his risen power. Thomas, actually, if you remember, had made it quite clear quite clear that to really believe himself, he needed to have a sense of assurance. Thomas had said that he needed, unless this happens, unless I'm able to see the nail marks in his hands, put my finger where the nails were, put my hand in his side, I will not believe. And so Jesus comes. And Thomas is full of confusion at first, because what happens is Jesus speaks to him and offers to do exactly what had been said to him, offers to do exactly what Thomas has said. But we're not told in any way, shape or form that Thomas did that. It doesn't say, and so Thomas placed his hands there, Thomas touched his side. The same words are found at the end of Luke's gospel also about that assurance that Jesus is offering to him. But then we have this marvelous confession of Thomas, my Lord and my God. It's a wonderful confession. You could call it the first great creedal confession in the life of the Resurrection Church. And it's Thomas who makes it. So it's really rather unfair that people talk about Thomas the Doubter. Thomas is a person of confession. And I believe it's important that we recognize at Easter time that we can go on a journey where Jesus comes and stands in our midst and breathes his risen power into our lives to give us hope and to give us purpose.